In foreign people obtaining property in the United States news, the state of Florida has a law that attempts to block Chinese citizens and other foreigners from buying property in its state. This is something that other states have done, not only in modern times, but also throughout the years. This has been something that various states have done for at least the last 100 years, trying to prevent foreign nationals from buying property within their state for a bunch of reasons. Sometimes these reasons are okay, sometimes not. We will look at what Florida is doing and try to assess. Let's get started with this. A group of Chinese citizens who are living and working in Florida sued the state Monday over a new law that would ban Chinese nationals from purchasing properties in large parts of the state. The law would apply to properties within 10 miles of a military installation and other critical infrastructure, and also affect citizens of Cuba, Venezuela, Syria, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. But Chinese citizens and those selling property to them face the harshest penalties. The prohibition also applies to agricultural land. The American Civil Liberties Union says the law will have a chilling effect on sales to Chinese and Asian people, who they say can legally buy property. The lawsuit says it unfairly equates Chinese people with the actions of their government, and there's no evidence of national security. All right, so let's discuss the law very briefly on this issue. The law is a bit complicated, but we can start with the U.S. Supreme Court in 1923, 100 years ago. In 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court heard the case of Terrace versus Thompson, which dealt with an issue in which a state, in this case, it was the state of Washington, passed a law which prohibited foreign nationals from purchasing, using, or leasing land. All right, so they said you can't do this. And again, it was also based on anti-Asian biases. This dealt with Japan, principally at the time, because of course, in 1923, our relationship with Japan was a lot different than it is today, as also our perception of Japanese Americans was a lot different than it is today. So in 1923, the state of Washington said the Japanese citizens can't purchase, use, or lease land in our state. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1923 said that this was legal and not a violation of the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection, but it guarantees equal protection of U.S. citizens and U.S. nationals. It doesn't guarantee equal protection necessarily when it comes to foreign nationals. So as it relates to that, that's fine. Now, where you get into a more tricky aspect is where a U.S. person or a U.S. national is involved in the transaction, or they're the descendant of someone who is a foreign national. So if you have a U.S. citizen or a U.S. national who is sometimes related to, we've had those cases, sometimes invested with, we've had those cases, sometimes a partner with, we've had those cases. If you have that situation, which is impacting U.S. persons, now suddenly you're in a lot more of a legal tricky situation because you can't really do that. So to the extent we're talking about just foreign companies, just foreign nationals, then probably lawful. To the extent we're talking about more complicated relationships, which, to be fair, in 2023, there are a lot more complicated relationships than there were in 1923, because in 2023, it's a lot easier for people to communicate all around the world in real time and to have much more complicated relationships because of things like planes and the internet and radio and other communication mediums that exist. So the degree to which foreign nationals are integrated or involved in these more complex relationships is, of course, a lot more complex than it was in 1923. So is it legal? Is it not legal? Well, it's going to depend on the details. And this is an area of law that is not particularly well defined, to my mind. It's not particularly well defined. So we will see how the courts look at this particular iteration of it. But there have been cases on this for at least 100 years on these kinds of issues. So we'll go scour the case law for the last 100 years and try to come up with an answer. But I don't think there are a lot of clean answers. The only cleanest answer we have, if it's strictly foreign, you can ban it. Beyond that, it's a little, but we'll see. The law will codify and expand housing discrimination against people of Asian descent. If they're people of Asian descent as opposed to being Asian in their own right, you have a potential legal problem. It could also cast an undue burden of suspicion on anyone seeking to buy property whose name sounds like it might be affiliated with those countries. So maybe that's the problem. We'll be discriminating based on people's names or ethnicity as opposed to their citizenship, which maybe that's a problem. So could be an issue, yes. US-China relationships are, of course, strained at the moment. In a nearly dozen state houses and Congress, this worry about foreign-owned ownership has spiked, including in the great state of Texas, which is also looking at measures along these lines. Not for the first time. Will they be upheld? Who knows? The Republican Governor DeSantis signed the bill into law. The law is set to take effect July 1st because it is very common, of course, for these things to take effect on July 1st or January 1st, depending on state. This would make it a felony for Chinese people to buy property in restricted areas or for any person to knowingly sell to those persons. For other targeted destinations, the penalty would be a misdemeanor. So we want to make it a felony with respect to China and only a misdemeanor for other people. Also unclear how we deal with people of mixed nationalities or mixed citizenships in potential relationships. Because, we have people, maybe we have an LLC somewhere that has maybe some Chinese people, maybe some Cuban people, maybe an American in there. How does that work? Good questions. Unclear. The law would apply to military installations as well as infrastructure like airports and seaports, water, wasteway, natural gas, oil processing, power plants, spaceports, and telecommunication. That part's probably legal. I mean, given the precedent from the Supreme Court, it's probably legal to just say statewide, period. So the state obviously doesn't have to go that far if it doesn't want to. But the state has made a choice to ban people within a 10-mile radius of all these places, which is probably legal, as long as we're only applying it to foreign nationals and foreign entities. But, that's a little bit tricky. The ACLU says this law will have a net effect of creating Chinese exclusion zones that could cover large parts of the state. This impacts exactly what laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and California Alien Land Law of 1913 did. Yeah, again, this is not the first time we've done this. It's not the first time the U.S. Supreme Court has had to consider this. So for at least 100 years since the Supreme Court wrote its decision in the case of Terrace versus Thompson, at least 100 years and further back, we've been dealing with this issue. So everything old is new again. Those on the restricted list that already own property must register with the state. I'm not sure to what end, but okay. They also are prohibited from acquiring additional property. The law has provisions to allow the state to seize property from violators. So for a taking as a fine, I don't know, that sounds tricky, right? So if we want to take land from people that already own it, we're thinking now that's some sort of fine, right? And now we're looking at a fine that is too high. So we're looking at an Eighth Amendment problem from people who already own land. We want to take land that they already own. Now we're thinking Eighth Amendment. The number of states restricting foreign ownership of land has risen 50%. Heading into 2023, 14 states have laws restricting ownership. Of course, this has been enacted in Arkansas, Idaho, Montana, Tennessee, Utah, Virginia, and very soon to come to Texas, because Texas is looking at this right now and almost certainly will pass some version of it, I would imagine. Foreign land ownership has become a political flashpoint, according to the National Agricultural Law Center, which I think, yeah, but not for the first time. The recent surge in state laws targeting land ownership by these foreign entities stems from some cases of Chinese-connected companies purchasing land near military bases. So is that nefarious? Is it not nefarious? Should we be concerned about it? I don't know, but that's what they're doing. Earlier this year, the U.S. Air Force said that a group affiliated with China planned a $700 million wet corn milling plant near a base in Grand Forks. And the U.S. government thought that this posed a significant threat to national security. So I'm sure they would be milling the wet corn, but what else are they doing? What is it a front for? What kind of base of operations? So the US government also concerned about these possibilities. After a Chinese army veteran and real estate tycoon bought a wind farm near an Air Force base, the state responded by banning infrastructure deals with individuals tied to governments, including China. That part, a lot less clear legally in sort of that. If you're merely tied to, that's a little bit unclear about that. So, some of this, yeah, it's a legal mess. Thus, that brings us to the end of the case of Florida being sued to block this law that prohibits Chinese citizens and other foreigners from buying property in the state. Is it legal? Maybe. In 1923, the Supreme Court said yes, if it's just the foreign nationals and just the foreign citizens. But today, with the relationships that we have and all that, it's a lot more complicated. So, this will obviously be fought over. And the case law is, I don't really think, very particularly uniform here. So there's not many bright line rules when it comes to this. So this will have to be sued over, and it will take a lot of effort and time because I think it's a bit legally messy. So we will see how that all progresses. And that, for the moment, brings this end of discussion of this case.